The summer night is thick and airless, the kind that hangs over Brooklyn like a curtain. It is the early 1990s, and a city that once pretended not to know about organized crime is now listening to it in real time. In a cramped FBI listening post, agents hunch over headphones while a reel-to-reel tape spins. On the scratchy line, voices drift in from a Brooklyn social club, men speaking low, careful, dropping names and codes. Amid the murmur, one name keeps returning, always with a mixture of respect and unease. Joe Waverly. To the agents, the name represents years of investigations and half-finished case files. To the men on the tape, it signals judgment, authority, and if you cross the wrong line, danger. Outside, headlines tell of internal wars tearing the Colombo crime family apart, of ambushed cars and bodies found on quiet streets. Inside the listening room, the agents know that behind the shorthand and code words are real neighborhoods, real families, and a man who has somehow risen from a quiet Brooklyn upbringing to become one of the most influential figures in one of New York's most violent criminal organizations. To understand how Joe Waverly, Cacace arrived at the center of this hidden world, you have to leave the wiretap room behind, step back through the decades, and return to post-war Brooklyn, where the lines between community, culture, and organized crime were, for many, far more blurred than anyone wanted to admit. Joel Cacace, better known in Underworld and press accounts as Joe Waverly, was born in 1941 in Brooklyn, New York, into an Italian-American world that was already deeply shaped by the forces that would define his adult life. In later law enforcement records and court filings, his name appears in a variety of spellings and forms: Joel, Joseph, Joe. But the man himself comes into focus only gradually. Unlike the flamboyant bosses who courted cameras and attention, Cacace left behind few public traces of his youth. There are no boyhood interviews, no nostalgic memoirs. What is known about his early years comes largely from the context of his neighborhood and the era into which he was born, and from the way investigators decades later tried to piece together how a quiet Brooklyn boy became a senior figure in the Colombo crime family. Brooklyn in the 1940s and 1950s was a borough in transition, crowded with returning veterans, new immigrants and families trying to build something stable after the chaos of the Great Depression and the Second World War. For Italian-American communities concentrated in pockets of South Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, Carroll Gardens, Red Hook, and other neighborhoods, life revolved around a set of tight circles: family, parish, corner stores, and street corners that were as much social clubs as they were intersections. Children like Cacace would have grown up hearing a mix of English and Italian dialects in the hallways, learning early on that respect for elders and loyalty to family were not sentimental ideas but survival strategies. At the same time, these neighborhoods were already home to what would later be called the American Mafia. By the time Cacace was born, the structure of New York's organized crime families had largely settled into the five families, recognized after the Castellamers War of the early 1930s. The group that would become known as the Colombo family had its roots in the Prophesy organization, a clan that quietly controlled rackets in Brooklyn and beyond for decades under the leadership of Joseph Cacace. For many residents, the mob was not some distant, cinematic entity. It was the well-dressed man at the cafe who always seemed to have money when others didn't, the older cousin who suddenly had a new car with no obvious job, or the local figure who could resolve a dispute more quickly than calling the police ever would. In this environment, a child growing up didn't necessarily join the underworld in a single dramatic moment. It was more often a gradual recognition that certain men in the neighborhood had more influence than others, that jobs and favors came through them, and that keeping your head down around them was often wise. For young men with limited economic options, especially in years when factory and dock work could be unpredictable, the allure of steady cash, status, and what appeared to be protection made those figures difficult to ignore. Whether or not Cacace consciously sought them out as a teenager is not documented, but later investigative files suggest that by the time he reached adulthood, he was already moving in circles where those men were present. The post-war years offered Italian-American families a path into the mainstream. The GI Bill, expanding suburbs, and unionized industrial work all opened doors that had previously been closed. But discrimination lingered, particularly in older institutions. For some, the route forward was college or civil service. For others, especially those who did not thrive in school or lacked family connections outside the neighborhood, opportunities felt narrower. Contemporary sociological studies of Brooklyn in the 1950s and 1960s describe a kind of parallel track, one in which upwardly mobile Italian Americans pushed into professions and suburbs, and another in which young men found themselves pulled deeper into street culture, with illegal gambling, shylocking, and protection rackets functioning as informal industries. By the early 1960s, law enforcement attention to organized crime had intensified dramatically. The 1957 Appalachian Meeting, a gathering of mob bosses in upstate New York broken up by state troopers, had shattered the official fiction that a national criminal network did not exist. In 1963, Joseph Cacace, a former soldier in the Genovese family, publicly testified before a U.S. Senate committee, describing for the first time the structure of La Cosa Nostra. Newspapers carried lurid headlines about crime families, bosses, and soldiers, and government agencies began to reorganize around the task of combating organized crime. Yet for neighborhood figures like Cacace, then in his late teens and early 20s, those developments likely felt both distant and oddly abstract. The hearings and reports spoke of syndicates and families in national terms, but on the street, day-to-day life still unfolded through personal connections. According to later FBI intelligence reports introduced in court, by the late 1960s agents in New York had begun to list Joe Waverly, Cacace, as an associate of known Colombo family members in Brooklyn. The details in those reports are sparse. They indicate contacts with established figures, note his presence at certain social clubs, and link his name to typical mob activities, illegal gambling and loan sharking particularly. But they do not offer a narrative of how he got there. What they do show is that, in the eyes of law enforcement, he had moved from being a face in the crowd to someone worth tracking. One of the few biographical threads that does surface in multiple sources concerns the origin of his Underworld nickname. Joe Waverly did not come from his given name, Joel, but rather from a stretch of Waverly Avenue in Brooklyn, where, according to investigators and later news coverage, he was a regular presence at a local social club or storefront hangout. Such nicknames, Joe Waverly, Sonny Red, Jimmy the Hat, were part of the vocabulary of the street, a shorthand that anchored men to places or traits. For law enforcement agents compiling charts of organized crime hierarchies, these monikers were often more familiar than legal names. In the case of Cacace, the nickname would eventually become so widely used in FBI reports and newspaper stories that many people outside his immediate circle assumed his first name was Joseph. As he moved into adulthood, Cacace's life, like that of many men in his generation, likely followed a double track. Outwardly, he inhabited the role of a working-class Brooklynite, while inwardly, he deepened his ties to an organization that kept its true workings hidden. Records from later trials indicate that he married and had children. His son, Joel Jr., would later surface in law enforcement documents as well. That detail, father and son appearing in the same investigative files, captures a difficult truth about organized crime in these neighborhoods. It existed not as an exotic external force, but as a pattern that could pass down within families, shaped by example and opportunity as much as by deliberate choice. The Colombo family that Cacace was entering in the 1960s had its own complicated history. After the death of Joseph Cacace in 1962 and the subsequent turmoil, control passed through several hands. By the end of the decade, Joseph Colombo SR had given the family its modern name, and unusually for a mob boss, thrust himself into the public eye. Through the Italian-American Civil Rights League, Colombo held rallies, spoke to cameras, and insisted that talk of a mafia was a slur against law-abiding Italian Americans. For young associates like Cacace, this period was a study in contrasts. The old code of silence on the one hand, and a boss openly holding mass demonstrations at Columbus Circle on the other. That experiment in publicity ended violently. In June 1971, during a League rally in Manhattan, Joseph Colombo was shot and left permanently incapacitated. The attack, widely believed to be rooted in rival mob politics, plunged the family into another period of instability. For those on the lower rungs, the message was unmistakable. The world they had joined was not just about quiet rackets and envelopes of cash. It was also about sudden turns of fortune and dangerous internal rivalries. In this environment of shifting leadership and public scrutiny, Cacace's defining traits, as described later by detectives and prosecutors, were his discretion and steadiness. He was not, in their accounts, the sort of street boss who craved limelight or built a reputation on theatrics. Rather, they described him as careful, methodical, someone who preferred to operate behind the scenes. That demeanor may have helped him survive the volatile years that followed, when the Colombo family, more than any of the other New York families, became known for internal conflict. From the perspective of law enforcement, the 1970s were a decade of incremental progress in understanding how figures like Cacace fit into the broader organized crime picture. New tools, expanded wiretapping powers, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, gave investigators a legal framework to target not just individual crimes, but the criminal enterprises behind them. In surveillance transcripts and informant reports filed during those years, Cacace's name appears with increasing frequency. The pattern suggests a man moving up, from the periphery of operations into more central roles, trusted enough to be present when serious matters were discussed. These developments, however, should not be mistaken for inevitability. The social currents that shaped Cacace's rise also shaped many other lives that did not end in prison or murder indictments. In the same neighborhoods, from the same tenements and parishes, came teachers, dock workers, small business owners, and police officers. The fact that some residents leveraged community networks to move into professional and political life, while others became embedded in organized crime, underscores the complexity of the environment rather than offering an excuse for individual choices. The circumstances that shaped a man like Cacace, tight-knit ethnic identity, economic pressure, and a powerful criminal subculture, did not dictate his path, but they did create a world in which that path was always visible. Yet by the close of the 1970s, the broad outlines of Cacace's future were taking shape. He had acquired a reputation with his peers as reliable and composed, and with law enforcement as a name that kept surfacing in connection with Colombo activities. The understated social club on or near Waverly Avenue, whose ordinary facade belied its status as a gathering point, had given him not only a nickname but a base. The New York underworld was beginning to change, challenged by new immigrant groups, evolving markets, and more aggressive policing. But the Colombo family still controlled significant rackets in labor, construction, and gambling. Within that world, Joe Waverly, Cacace was no longer just another neighborhood figure. He was, step by step, becoming part of the internal machinery of a crime family whose conflicts and decisions would soon spill far beyond Brooklyn's side streets and into the headlines, courtroom testimony, and ultimately, the cell blocks where much of his later life would be spent. By the late 1970s, the name Joe Waverly was beginning to mean something more than just a reference to a Brooklyn street. For detectives driving slow circuits past dimly lit club fronts, and for FBI agents sorting through stacks of surveillance reports, It signaled a particular figure in the Colombo family's Brooklyn structure, someone who had moved beyond casual association and into the ranks of serious operators. The transformation had not been sudden. It was the product of a decade in which the world of organized crime was forced out of the shadows in official rhetoric, even as it remained deeply embedded in everyday life in neighborhoods like the one that had shaped Joel Cacace. The law enforcement record from this period is fragmentary but telling. Internal FBI memoranda and New York Police Department intelligence files, some of which would be summarized years later in court, show agents tracing the patterns of who met whom, where they gathered, and how money flowed. In those notes, Cacace's name, or his alias, appears alongside that of established Colombo figures. He is listed as present at backroom card games that functioned as informal business meetings, identified as traveling with known captains, and occasionally mentioned in connection with disputes over gambling territory or loan collections. None of these entries on their own amount to a narrative. Together, they chart an advance, from marginal presence to recognized participant. Within the culture of the American Mafia, the formal step that distinguished hangers-on from insiders was initiation, becoming what members called a friend of ours, a sworn soldier. Law enforcement agencies have never had a complete or official list of who was made in any family at any given time, but decades of informant testimony and bugged conversations have sketched the outlines. In Cacace's case, federal prosecutors and cooperating witnesses would later state that by the late 1970s he was considered a full member of the Colombo family. That status meant more than a title. It implied that he had proven himself useful and reliable, that senior figures trusted him with sensitive tasks, and that he was now bound by the internal code of obedience and secrecy that governed the organization. For someone in his position, day-to-day activity usually revolved around rackets that seemed, on the surface, almost mundane. Illegal gambling, sports betting, numbers games, card rooms, had long been a cornerstone of mob finances, particularly in working-class neighborhoods where legal entertainment options were limited and distrust of official channels ran high. Loan sharking, another staple, exploited those same conditions. A bar owner struggling with slow business, a driver laid off from the docks, a small contractor behind on bills. They might all find that a quiet word at the right social club could produce cash when a bank would not. The price, of course, came later, in interest rates that could spiral beyond reach, and in a level of pressure no legitimate lender could apply. According to later government filings, Cacace's crew, by then he was supervising a group of lower-level associates even before he formally held the rank of captain, was involved in precisely these kinds of enterprises. Businesses in parts of Brooklyn knew that certain men were with him, that they collected on debts or oversaw particular games. To outsiders, the operations could be easy to underestimate. A few card tables in a back room, a handful of bookmakers taking bets over pay phones, envelopes passed on Friday nights. But taken together, these activities generated steady revenue for the family and reinforced its reputation for control over its turf. The harm these schemes caused often unfolded quietly. A shop owner might agree to pay a weekly fee for vague protection, because he knew what had happened to another proprietor who refused. A gambler who fell too deeply into debt might find his life narrowed down to a single priority, making payments however he could, for neighbors looking in. From the outside, the men enforcing these systems could seem paradoxical, even contradictory. They might donate to a parish fundraiser, send flowers to a funeral, or pay a month's rent for a struggling widow, actions that helped build loyalty and silence. Yet the same network ensured that when money was owed, it would be collected, and that few would risk challenging their authority or going to the police. By the early 1980s, Cacace had become, in the assessment of multiple later witnesses, the leader of his own crew within the Colombo family, a capo. That promotion formalized what had already been taking shape. He now had responsibility for a defined group of soldiers and associates, and for the income they generated. It also pushed him deeper into the family's internal politics. A captain answered directly to the family's higher leadership, the underboss, the consigliere, and the boss himself. In the Colombo organization, that meant Carmine, the snake Persico, a man whose influence over the family would persist from prison for decades. Persico's world, by this time, was under unprecedented pressure. The federal government, armed with the RICO statute and emboldened by the success of earlier investigations, turned its focus to the very top of New York's organized crime structure. In 1985 and 1986, U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani's office prosecuted the so-called commission case, targeting leaders of the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families for collectively directing labor racketeering and other organized crimes. Persico, arrested and brought to trial, represented himself in court, an unusual and risky choice. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to a 100-year prison term. Persico's conviction did not end his role in the Colombo family. From a federal facility, he continued to communicate with loyalists, issuing directives and attempting to manage the organization's affairs. This arrangement, an imprisoned boss ruling through intermediaries, created a complicated dynamic. On paper, acting bosses and official panels were installed to handle daily operations. In practice, the real power often remained with those closest to the imprisoned leader, men who could interpret and relay his wishes. According to later testimony, Joe Waverly Cacace became one of those key intermediaries. Cooperating witnesses who had spent years inside the Colombo organization described Cacace as firmly aligned with the Persico faction. They portrayed him as quietly influential, someone whose counsel carried weight and who could speak with the authority of the boss's camp. His reputation as calm and deliberate suited this role. In a criminal culture that often rewarded displays of bravado, he stood out for his low-key manner. That did not make him benign. Stability in this context meant maintaining control over lucrative, coercive rackets and enforcing the family's rules. But it did make him, in the eyes of Persico loyalists, a stabilizing figure amid growing uncertainty. That uncertainty was not only external. Inside the Colombo family, Persico's imprisonment and the wider crackdown on organized crime intensified existing tensions. The designation of acting bosses from within different factions sowed resentment. Some members believed that Persico's grip from behind bars was damaging the family's long-term interests. Others viewed any challenge to him as betrayal. These pressures built slowly through the late 1980s, as law enforcement scrutiny mounted and traditional revenue streams came under strain. Meanwhile, on the street level, Cacace's position ensured that he was a frequent subject of investigative attention. Wiretaps placed on phones connected to his crew, hidden microphones in social clubs, and the reports of undercover agents all fed into an expanding portrait. Federal authorities compiled organizational charts that placed him above street-level enforcers and below the very top of the hierarchy. In some instances, he was named in search warrants. In others, his voice appeared, often indirectly referenced rather than clearly recorded, in transcripts of conversations between other mobsters. One of the recurring themes in those documents is caution. References to Joe or Waverly were often couched in vague terms, and business discussions were frequently broken off or moved outside when sensitive topics arose. He was not, however, beyond legal reach. Like many mid- and high-level figures in New York's crime families, Cacace accumulated what might be called a standard portfolio of early legal entanglements. Investigative detentions, appearances before grand juries, and occasional arrests on charges such as illegal gambling or weapons possession. Public reporting from later years suggests that these early cases resulted in limited consequences, fines, short stints in custody, or dismissals, without disrupting his broader role in the family's affairs. To law enforcement, this pattern was familiar and frustrating. The people they believed to be orchestrating major criminal enterprises often appeared in court only for relatively minor charges, shielded by layers of insulation between themselves and the most visible acts of violence or intimidation. In the neighborhoods where he operated, the social conflicts surrounding figures like Cacace played out in subtler ways. On one side, there were residents who saw the local mob presence as a fact of life, something that might even, in limited senses, keep order by deterring certain kinds of street crime. On another were those who understood, sometimes from painful first-hand experience, how deeply the rackets drained small businesses and families. Advocates and clergy in Brooklyn parishes spoke out periodically against loan sharks and gambling dens. Community groups pushed for greater police presence and economic alternatives. Yet the combined weight of fear, habit, and the enduring appeal of quick money meant that real resistance was often fragile. Against this backdrop, Cacace's quiet ascent continued. By the end of the 1980s, he was widely regarded, in both underworld and official circles, as one of the Colombo family's more trusted and capable managers. His nickname, once a simple geographic tag, had become shorthand among investigators for a particular cluster of operations and relationships. For the Colombo family's leadership, he was part of the inner circle of Persico loyalists in Brooklyn, men who could be relied upon to keep revenue flowing, discipline in place, and the boss's directives enforced, even with prison bars in between. Those years also saw the criminal landscape of New York begin to shift in broader ways. New competitors emerged in the drug trade. Law enforcement successes weakened some traditional mob footholds in unions and construction. The constant pressure of investigations, from local task forces to federal organized crime squads, compelled families like the Colombos to adapt. Meetings moved further from traditional haunts. Pay phones were favored over home lines. Coded language became more intricate. Yet human habits and social patterns were difficult to change entirely. The same clubs on Waverly Avenue and elsewhere in Brooklyn remained important centers of gravity, and men like Cacace, who had spent their lives in those environments, continued to rely on them. Inside the Colombo organization, the unresolved question of succession and control sharpened into open conflict as the decade closed. The appointment of Victor Orna as acting boss in Persico's absence, meant to be temporary, created a rival pole of authority. Disputes over loyalty, money, and the future direction of the family grew more pointed. Lines were drawn, often quite literally, street by street and crew by crew. In that looming confrontation, Cacace's long-cultivated reputation as a steady Persico man would place him squarely on one side of what would soon become one of the most violent internal wars in modern mafia history. When the first shots of that internal struggle were fired in the early 1990s, they would reverberate far beyond the quiet backrooms where Cacace had spent so much of his career. For the public, the war would bring the reality of organized crime's internal brutality starkly into view, with ambushes on city streets and headlines about factional killings. For law enforcement, it would both complicate and accelerate investigations, as the bodies created new pressure on insiders to cooperate. And for Cacace himself, the conflict would mark the beginning of a new, more perilous phase in his life, one in which his status as a behind-the-scenes manager would intersect directly with the spotlight of high-profile indictments and, eventually, long-term imprisonment. In the winter of 1991, anxiety settled over certain corners of Brooklyn in a way that people in those neighborhoods could feel but not always name. On the surface, life went on. Children walked to school, parish bells rang on Sundays, bars opened and closed on schedule. But there were new patterns, cars that seemed to linger too long at corners, men who changed their routes home, conversations that stopped abruptly when the wrong face appeared. Within the Colombo crime family, A conflict that had simmered for months was hardening into open war. Joe Waverly Cacace, by then a seasoned captain and trusted Persico loyalist, found himself in the middle of a struggle that would define both his reputation and the future shape of the organization he had spent decades serving. The roots of the crisis lay in a decision made years earlier. When Carmine Persico was convicted in the mid-1980s and sent to prison on federal racketeering charges, he had attempted to maintain his grip on the Colombo family from behind bars. To handle daily operations, he approved the elevation of Victor "Little Vic" Orna, a longtime lieutenant, as acting boss. For a time, the arrangement held. Money continued to flow. The family's rackets in gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering still produced steady returns. But power at the top of a mafia family was never simple. As the years passed, Orna accumulated his own influence and followers, and a question emerged that could no longer be sidestepped. Was he merely a caretaker, or was he the rightful boss? Law enforcement affidavits and later trial testimonies show how that question turned into a fault line. By 1990, Persico loyalists, guided in part by messages relayed from federal prison, were pressing to ensure that his own bloodline, especially his son, Alphonse "Alley Boy" Persico, would ultimately inherit control. Orna and his supporters, for their part, resented what they saw as micromanagement from a man serving a century-long sentence. The tension was not just about titles. It was about who would oversee lucrative criminal businesses, who would appoint captains, and whose word would carry final weight in disputes. Cacace's place in this emerging divide was unambiguous. According to FBI reports and statements by cooperating witnesses, he was regarded as firmly in the Persico camp. As a Brooklyn-based captain with a reputation for discretion and reliability, he was precisely the kind of figure Persico's inner circle depended on. Someone who could keep crews in line, handle money flow, and transmit instructions without drawing unnecessary attention. Several later cooperators described him as one of the men Persico trusted to look after things in Brooklyn, a link in the chain between the imprisoned boss and the street. In 1991, the fragile balance broke. Law enforcement documents describe how Persico loyalists received word that Orna was allegedly maneuvering to have himself formally recognized as boss, effectively cutting Persico's faction out of decision-making. The response, coordinated among Persico's closest allies, was drastic. They would move first to neutralize Orna. A plan was hatched to ambush him near his home in Howard Beach, Queens. The attempt failed. Orna, warned or simply lucky, escaped the trap. But in the culture of the mafia, such an overt move left no room for negotiation. What might have remained a struggle of influence turned overnight into a shooting war. From that point on, life for anyone associated with the Colombo family became more dangerous. Membership cards, formal ranks, and years of shared history offered little protection. Men who had once sat together at weddings or baptisms now viewed one another as potential targets. Crews were divided into clear camps, those loyal to Persico and those who sided with Orna. The violence that followed was not a single eruption, but a series of incidents that stretched over nearly 2 years, leaving more than a dozen people dead and many more wounded. Some of the victims were high-ranking figures. Others were lower-level operatives caught on the wrong street at the wrong time. In a few cases, bystanders were harmed, a stark reminder that the internal disputes of a criminal organization could spill into the lives of people with no connection to it. Law enforcement agencies, already focused on organized crime, intensified their efforts as the conflict played out. Task forces of FBI agents, NYPD detectives, and federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York treated the war both as an opportunity and as a serious public safety threat. The open hostility created new chances to recruit informants, men who, facing the double pressure of potential retaliation from rivals and long prison terms, might decide to cooperate. At the same time, the volatility made surveillance perilous. Following targets through neighborhoods where shots had recently been fired carried its own risks. In this environment, Cacace's long-cultivated habits of caution were tested. According to surveillance logs and informant accounts, he reduced his visible movements, favored controlled environments such as trusted social clubs, and relied on intermediaries to handle riskier tasks. Unlike some figures who built reputations by personally confronting rivals, he stayed in the background, functioning more as a strategist and administrator. Cooperators would later describe meetings where Persico-aligned captains, including Cacace, discussed how to protect their people, maintain revenue streams, and anticipate moves by the Orna camp. The very fact that such conversations occurred at all gave investigators valuable insight into how the Persico faction structured itself during the conflict. The war sharpened the distinction between those who approached criminal life as a business and those whose temperaments pulled them toward confrontation. Notorious Persico loyalists such as Gregory Scarpa Sr., later revealed to have been an FBI informant even as he participated in violent acts, appeared regularly in accounts of direct attacks and reprisals. Cacace, in contrast, surfaced mostly in planning and oversight roles. That difference did not make him a peripheral figure. If anything, it underscored the diversity of functions within a crime family. Some men enforced decisions, others helped make them. For residents of the affected neighborhoods, the human cost was inescapable. Newspaper reports from the early 1990s detailed shootings outside cafes, attacks in parking lots, and sudden confrontations on residential streets. Families altered routines, avoiding certain corners or closing businesses earlier than usual. Community leaders and clergy condemned the violence, urging cooperation with law enforcement and greater investment in youth programs to offer alternatives to street life. Yet the fear that came with being labeled a rat remained powerful, especially in areas where mob influence had been entrenched for decades. Inside investigative offices, analysts tried to map the fast-changing landscape. Wiretaps on phones linked to Colombo members captured tense conversations in which names like Joe Waverly appeared as part of broader discussions about allegiances and moves. In some cases, informants relayed that Persico's imprisoned leadership had designated a small group of trusted men, including Cacace, to help steer the family through the crisis. Statements from later cooperating witnesses suggested that he was sometimes viewed as a voice of restraint, someone who advocated targeted actions over indiscriminate violence, not out of humanitarian concern, but from a calculation that high-profile bloodshed brought only more heat from authorities. The eventual outcome of the Colombo War was shaped as much by law enforcement as by internal tactics. A series of arrests removed key Orna loyalists from the street, and in 1992, Orna himself was convicted on racketeering and murder charges and sentenced to life in prison. Without a central rival figure, his faction gradually lost cohesion. Persico's side, despite suffering its own losses, emerged with its leadership structure, centered on the imprisoned boss and his closest allies, largely intact. The war had cost the family heavily in manpower, reputation, and investigative attention, but it had not broken Persico's hold. In the post-war landscape, Cacace's position rose even further. Federal indictments and organized crime intelligence summaries from the mid-1990s frequently placed him alongside the very top tier of Colombo leadership. Different sources used different titles. Some described him as consigliere, others as acting boss or a de facto street leader for Persico. But the underlying point was consistent. He was regarded as one of the men most directly involved in charting the family's course. His crew, based largely in Brooklyn, remained an important hub for gambling and loan operations, and he was increasingly seen as a point of contact for resolving disputes and coordinating with other families on shared rackets. This visibility had consequences. In 1992 and 1993, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn brought sweeping racketeering cases tied to the Colombo War and the family's broader activities. Indictments named dozens of defendants, from street-level shooters to high-ranking captains. In those documents and in related investigative material, Cacace appeared as both a target and a reference point, someone whose role prosecutors asserted as part of demonstrating the existence of an organized, hierarchical criminal enterprise. Some charges against him would result in convictions and prison time. Others would be dismissed or resolved in plea agreements. What is clear from the public record is that, by the mid-1990s, he was no longer a relatively obscure neighborhood figure. He was a familiar name in federal dockets and press reports covering organized crime. Outside the courtroom, the social currents that had once nudged young men toward or away from mob life were shifting. New York City in the early 1990s was undergoing broad changes. Crime rates, though still high early in the decade, would soon begin a notable decline. Political leaders championed quality of life policing, and new immigrant communities were reshaping neighborhoods that had been Italian-American strongholds for generations. Traditional mafia rackets in unions and construction came under increasingly effective scrutiny from specialized law enforcement units. For someone like Cacace, who had built a career within a classic mid-20th century organized crime model, adapting to this evolving environment required both caution and creativity. Part of that adaptation involved an even greater emphasis on insulation. Testimony from cooperating witnesses in later years described how leaders like Cacace reduced their use of telephones, favored face-to-face meetings in carefully chosen locations, and relied more heavily on trusted intermediaries to buffer them from direct involvement in extortions or collections. Money flowed upward through layers of collectors and sub-bosses. Instructions moved downward the same way. The goal was clear: to make it as difficult as possible for prosecutors to tie the top figures to specific criminal acts. Even so, cracks continued to appear in the code of silence that had long protected mafia leaders. The trauma of the Colombo War, coupled with the prospect of extended sentences under RICO, pushed some members and associates to cooperate. Each new cooperator added to law enforcement's understanding of how the family functioned and who occupied which roles. Over time, a detailed picture emerged: organizational charts, lists of social clubs and meeting spots, descriptions of how disputes were adjudicated, and accounts of who had the authority to approve major decisions. In many of these narratives, Cacace appeared as one of the senior figures whose approval was required for serious actions. The war years also took a more personal toll. Although Cacace, true to his low-key nature, kept his private life away from cameras and reporters, court filings and investigative reporting offer glimpses. His marriage ended, a rupture that would later have far-reaching consequences when his ex-wife entered a new relationship. Family members found themselves living under a shadow of surveillance and notoriety. Children and relatives, whatever paths they chose, could not easily escape the knowledge that their surname, or in some circles, the nickname Waverly, carried associations with a high-ranking figure in an embattled crime family. By the middle of the 1990s, Joe Waverly Cacace was, in many ways, at the peak of his influence and at the edge of a precipice. Internally, he had survived a brutal internal war and emerged as a key architect of the Persico faction's continued control. Externally, he faced a legal environment more hostile and more sophisticated than any previous generation of mob leaders had known. Every meeting he attended, every associate he trusted, carried the risk of hidden microphones or quiet cooperation with the government. Yet the incentives that had drawn him into organized crime decades earlier, financial gain, status within his community, the sense of belonging to a powerful structure, remained present. The next phase of his life would be shaped by an event that, on its surface, appeared intensely personal but quickly took on broader legal and symbolic significance. The killing of an off-duty New York City police officer in 1997, a crime that prosecutors would later allege was ordered by Cacace in retaliation for a perceived personal slight. That allegation, and the long, complex legal battles that followed, would move him from the realm of specialized organized crime reporting into the wider public eye, transforming the narrative of Joe Waverly from that of an internal strategist to that of a man accused of reaching across the boundary between underworld and law enforcement itself. On a late August night in 1997, the streets of Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, were quiet in the way they often are at the end of a humid summer day. Just before midnight, off-duty New York City police officer Ralph Dawes pulled up near his home on West 11th Street, parking his car as he had done many times before. He was 28 years old, a housing cop assigned to Brooklyn, recently remarried, and by all accounts looking forward to the future more than thinking about the past. Moments later, that future ended. As he stepped from his vehicle, gunmen confronted him and opened fire. Neighbors heard the shots, saw shadows, and called 911. By the time other officers and emergency workers arrived, it was too late. The killing was swift, targeted, and to investigators, immediately suggestive of something more than a random crime. Within hours, the outlines of a troubling possibility came into view. Ralph Dawes was not just any officer. He was married to a woman with deep ties to the Colombo crime family. His wife, Kim, had previously been married to Joe Waverly Cacace. That connection between a slain cop and the ex-wife of a high-ranking mob figure instantly transformed the case from a local homicide into a matter of city-wide and eventually national attention. Even before the sun rose, senior NYPD officials and FBI agents were coordinating, aware that if organized crime had reached into law enforcement in such a direct way, the implications would be enormous. To understand why that marriage caused such alarm, it is necessary to step back into the intertwined personal and underworld histories involved. Kim, sometimes described in press accounts as a mob wife, or more breathlessly, as a kind of underworld royalty, had been married to Cacace during years when his influence within the Colombo family was growing. The relationship produced children and placed her, for a time, at the center of a social world shaped by crime family rituals, expectations, and hierarchies. Divorce did not erase those memories or connections. When she later entered into a relationship with an NYPD officer and became his wife, she effectively bridged two worlds that were, in principle, completely opposed. In the culture of traditional organized crime, personal relationships, especially involving wives and family, were loaded with meaning. Codes of respect and loyalty, though often romanticized, had very practical implications. A former wife who began a new life with a law enforcement officer could be seen, in some eyes, as crossing a boundary, even if she herself had never been a criminal participant. That perception, when filtered through the lens of a group that routinely conflated personal pride with organizational discipline, could turn private decisions into matters of honor or retribution. It is within this fraught cultural context that law enforcement, almost from the first day, considered the possibility that Ralph Dawes' murder was not random, but ordered. The NYPD's response reflected the gravity of that suspicion. A large task force was assembled, combining homicide detectives, organized crime specialists, and federal agents. They canvassed the neighborhood, re-interviewed any possible witnesses, and scoured Dawes' professional and personal life for leads. Was he killed because of something he had done as a police officer, perhaps in connection with an arrest? Or was the motive personal, rooted in his marriage and the people connected to it? Both tracks were pursued vigorously. Almost immediately, attention turned toward the Colombo family. Within that organization, Cacace was, by 1997, a well-established figure, widely regarded as part of the family's senior leadership aligned with the Persico faction. For investigators, the fact that the victim had married his ex-wife could not be dismissed as coincidence. Yet suspicion alone was not evidence. No one came forward to say they had seen Cacace threaten dolls. No direct physical evidence linked him to the scene. What investigators had, initially, were patterns: the method of the killing, the victim's connections, and the knowledge that the Colombo family had a history of using violence to settle perceived affronts. Media coverage amplified these threads. Newspapers reported that internal police memos identified organized crime as a likely factor. Articles mentioned Cacace by name, describing him as a reputed Colombo consigliere or acting boss, and highlighting his former marriage to Kim. This attention, in turn, colored public perception. To many readers, the story seemed almost scripted. A mob leader's ex-wife marries a cop, and the cop ends up dead. But inside the precincts and federal offices where the case was actually being worked, the reality was more complicated. Investigators knew that bringing a solid case against someone of Cacace's stature would require more than a compelling narrative. It would require witnesses willing to break the Underworld's code of silence, or other hard evidence tying decisions made in dimly lit social clubs to the gunfire on West 11th Street. While the Dolls investigation consumed headlines and resources, life in the Underworld did not pause. The Colombo family, battered but not destroyed by its civil war, continued to operate. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering brought in money. New members were initiated. Old alliances were renegotiated. Within this structure, according to FBI intelligence, Cacace continued to function as a senior decision-maker. The murder of an NYPD officer and the intense scrutiny it brought undoubtedly complicated his day-to-day operations. Social clubs were watched more closely. Phones believed to be connected to his associates were targeted for wiretaps. Yet from law enforcement's perspective, there remained a frustrating gap between their belief that he played a role and the sort of evidence that would stand up in court. In the weeks and months after the killing, detectives followed every plausible lead. They looked at Dawes' work history, examining cases he had been involved in to see whether any might have created a dangerous enemy. They reviewed his finances and social circle, searching for hidden disputes or debts. Nothing they found offered a more convincing explanation than the one that had appeared on the first night, that he had been targeted because of whom he had married. But even that motive was, at the time, supported more by inference than by testimony. The gunmen who had approached him melted back into the urban landscape. If anyone in the neighborhood recognized them, loyalty and fear kept mouths closed. At the same time, investigators probed the Colombo family itself. Known associates were brought in for questioning or compelled to appear before grand juries. Some spoke in vague generalities, insisting they knew nothing about any plot against a police officer. Others invoked their right against self-incrimination. No one provided the kind of inside account that could unlock the case. For many years, that stalemate persisted. Within the tight circles of the Colombo organization, people might whisper or speculate about who had authorized what, but such conversations did not reach detectives in a form they could use. For Cacace personally, the Dolls' murder marked a turning point in how the outside world perceived him. Previously, he had been a figure known to specialized reporters and organized crime units, his name linked to internal mob wars and underworld rackets. Now, he was publicly associated, through allegation, not proof, with the killing of a police officer. Even without an indictment, that association carried weight. Articles describing the case routinely referred to him as a suspected mastermind, or the man who allegedly ordered the hit, careful with legal qualifiers but clear in implication. For his family, including children from his marriage to Kim, the result was a painful tangle of personal grief, suspicion, and notoriety. Meanwhile, the larger legal campaign against the Colombo family intensified. In the later 1990s, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York brought a series of expansive racketeering indictments aimed at cutting into the family's leadership ranks. Drawing on the RICO statute, they charged bosses, underbosses, captains, and soldiers with participating in an enterprise responsible for a litany of crimes: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and numerous acts of violence committed over many years. In these broad cases, individuals were not only held to account for their own actions, but were also tied to the organization's collective criminal conduct. Cacace was among those drawn into this widening legal net. He faced federal racketeering charges that portrayed him as a central player in the Colombo family's operations. The indictments, assembled from years of surveillance, informant statements, and financial analysis, alleged that he had helped direct the family's activities, manage its income streams, and uphold its rules through intimidation and violence. In court, prosecutors painted a picture of a methodical, long-serving leader. Defense attorneys, as in other organized crime cases, attacked the credibility of cooperating witnesses and argued that the government was stretching limited evidence to fit a preconceived theory of hierarchy. In the early 2000s, confronted with the strength of the overall racketeering case, and aware of the stiff sentences that could follow if convicted at trial, Cacace chose to resolve at least some of the charges through a guilty plea. He admitted participation in a racketeering conspiracy involving the Colombo family's criminal enterprises. The specifics of what he acknowledged, as outlined in court records, included control over illegal gambling and loan sharking operations and responsibility for supervising subordinates who committed crimes to further the organization's goals. He was sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison. It was a significant moment. A man who had navigated the shadows of the underworld for decades, largely avoiding long stretches behind bars, now faced many years in custody. That conviction did not resolve the outstanding question of Ralph Dawes's murder. The plea did not concede involvement in that crime, and prosecutors at the time did not bring the Dawes case directly into the courtroom as a charged offense. Still, the fact that Cacace was now in federal custody changed the investigative landscape. Agents and prosecutors could question him more readily. They could also use his imprisonment and the awareness among his associates that he was no longer on the street to pressure others. Some saw an opportunity. If lower-level participants in the Dawes plot existed, they might be more vulnerable to outreach now that one of the most senior figures in the family was behind bars. The early 2000s brought another crucial development to the broader fight against organized crime: a growing willingness among some longtime mob members to cooperate with authorities. Facing the possibility of life sentences under RICO and seeing the traditional mafia's influence wane, a number of former loyalists began to talk. Each new cooperator added pieces to the puzzle: accounts of meetings, descriptions of who reported to whom, recollections of conversations about past crimes. In time, some of these men provided detailed allegations about the Dawes murder, identifying alleged shooters, and critically, claiming that the order had come from Joe Waverly, Cacace, as a matter of personal vengeance cloaked in organizational discipline. These accounts, given to prosecutors under cooperation agreements, did not immediately translate into public indictments. Investigators knew that cases built largely on the word of insiders needed careful corroboration. They cross-checked timelines, compared one cooperator's story with another's, and looked for physical or documentary evidence to support key details. Some of what they heard matched what they had long suspected: that the crime had been carefully planned and discussed among a small group of trusted men. Other elements raised new questions about exact roles and motives, but taken together, the emerging picture was far more detailed than what detectives had possessed in the late 1990s. Throughout this period, Cacace remained in federal custody, serving his racketeering sentence. His physical removal from Brooklyn did not erase his history there. Within organized crime circles, he was still spoken of as a former consigliere and acting boss, a man who had guided the Colombo family through some of its most turbulent years. Within law enforcement circles, He was increasingly seen as the key to an unresolved case that had weighed heavily on the NYPD and the Dawes family for years. If prosecutors could credibly link him to the murder of a police officer, it would not only bring a measure of closure, but also send a powerful message about accountability at the highest levels of organized crime. For the family of Ralph Dawes, the passage of time without charges was its own kind of burden. Every anniversary of the killing brought renewed media attention, retellings of the basic facts, and often reminders of the suspected connection to Cacace and the Colombo family. Kim, already living in the complicated space between her past life as a mob wife and her present as a police widow, found her story retold by others, sometimes simplistically, sometimes with sympathy. Their private loss had become a public symbol of the intersection between organized crime and law enforcement, with all the emotional and political weight that entailed. By the middle of the 2000s, the pieces were in place for a new legal chapter. Federal prosecutors had built up a store of insider testimony about the Colombo family's activities during the 1990s, including multiple murders and conspiracies. They had at their disposal the tools of the RICO statute, which allowed them to treat these acts not as isolated events, but as parts of a single enterprise. And they had, in the background, the unsolved killing of an NYPD officer that had haunted investigations for years. The question was not whether they would act on this information, but when and how, whether to fold the Dawes allegations into a larger racketeering case, to pursue them separately, or to continue waiting for even stronger corroboration. For Joe Waverly Cacace, the years after his racketeering conviction were spent inside federal walls, but the legal story surrounding him was anything but static. His earlier life, in the social clubs off Waverly Avenue, in the backrooms where Colombo leaders argued and planned, in the fraught family dynamics that spilled over into public violence, was now being dissected in proffer sessions and grand jury testimony. Men who had once deferred to him were now, in some cases, describing his alleged decisions to federal agents. The image of a reserved, steady mob leader that had kept him largely out of the spotlight for decades was giving way to a different portrayal, that of a central figure in some of the most contentious and painful episodes in the Colombo family's modern history, including, according to prosecutors, the long unsolved murder of a young police officer on a Brooklyn street. The slow, methodical work that investigators began after Ralph Dawes was killed did not end when Joe Waverly Cacace went to prison on racketeering charges. If anything, his conviction made it easier for them to keep pulling at the loose threads that led back to that August night in 1997. Over time, men who had once walked carefully into Brooklyn social clubs began walking just as carefully into federal interview rooms. Some came in shackled from other cases. Others arrived under cover of secrecy, hoping their cooperation would remain hidden from the underworld they were about to betray. The picture they drew for prosecutors was more detailed than anything the NYPD task force had been able to assemble in the immediate aftermath of the killing. Among these insiders were former Colombo family soldiers and captains who had taken part in violence themselves. Facing the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison, they weighed the mob's code of silence against the government's offer of reduced sentences and protection. In exchange for leniency, they were expected to tell everything about rackets, about internal wars, about who gave which order and why. Their stories, shaped by self-interest and years of criminal thinking, had to be treated with caution. Prosecutors compared one account to another, cross-checked details against old surveillance logs and phone records, and looked for the small, verifiable facts that could lend credibility to testimony about the larger, more serious crimes. Bit by bit, a consistent narrative about the Dawes murder emerged among these accounts. Several cooperators independently pointed to the same basic structure, that the decision to kill the off-duty officer had come from senior leadership aligned with the Persico faction of the Colombo family, and that Joe Waverly Cacace had been at the center of that decision. The motive, they said, was not a professional action Dawes had taken as a police officer, but the intensely personal matter of his marriage to Cacace's former wife. In their telling, this personal grievance was reframed inside the organization as a question of respect and security, and then translated into an order that subordinated had an obligation to carry out. According to these cooperating witnesses, the plot was discussed in private settings among a small circle of trusted men. A team of shooters was allegedly selected from within the Persico loyal network, men who were known for their willingness to commit violence on behalf of the family. The preparations, as described in later testimony, followed familiar underworld patterns: surveillance of the target, planning around his schedule, efforts to ensure that he would be unarmed and off-duty when the attack came. The accounts differed on minor points: who drove which car, where certain conversations took place, but on the central allegation they converged: that Ralph Dawes was killed in an orchestrated hit, and that the ultimate authorization had come from Cacace. For years, these stories existed mainly in sealed proffer sessions and internal memos. Prosecutors understood both their power and their vulnerability. Juries are often skeptical of witnesses who admit to serious crimes and then testify in hopes of reducing their own punishment. Defense attorneys, especially those experienced in organized crime cases, know how to attack such testimony by highlighting inconsistencies, stressing the witness's motives to lie, and pointing to the benefits they stand to receive. Building a case that hinged on these insiders meant assembling as much independent corroboration as possible, even if absolute, forensic proof of every detail remained out of reach. As the 2000s wore on, the broader legal campaign against the Colombo family continued. New indictments targeted figures who had escaped earlier sweeps or had risen to prominence in the wake of the internal war. High-profile trials produced a steady stream of convictions for racketeering, murder, extortion, and other crimes tied to the family's long history of violence and corruption. Through it all, the Dawes case remained a particularly charged subject inside law enforcement circles. It was a killing that touched one of their own. To close it with anything less than a fully developed case risked criticism from within their ranks as well as from the public. Toward the end of the 2000s and into the early years of the next decade, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn finally took a decisive step. They brought a new indictment that, for the first time, expressly charged Joe Waverly Cacace with involvement in the Dawes murder. Filed under the federal racketeering statutes, the case alleged that the killing was not simply a personal vendetta, but part of the Colombo family's pattern of using violence to protect its interests and enforce its own codes. The charges linked Dawes' death to the broader criminal enterprise that Cacace and others were accused of directing. The indictment electrified the NYPD and the Dawes family. After more than a decade of uncertainty, there was now a formal accusation that pointed not just to unnamed mob figures, but to a specific man long rumored to have ordered the killing. Press reports quoted law enforcement officials praising the work that had finally brought the case to this point, while also acknowledging the painful length of the journey. For Kim, who had lived under the shadow of suspicion and media scrutiny since the night her husband was killed, the development was both a validation of her long-held belief that the murder was connected to her past and a reopening of old wounds. Cacace, already serving a federal sentence for racketeering, now faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, even if he somehow managed to secure early release on his existing term. The new charges were serious: racketeering acts that included the planning and authorization of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and related offenses. Through court-appointed counsel, he pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for a complex legal battle. His defense team signaled early on that they would attack the credibility of the government's cooperating witnesses, framing them as self-interested criminals willing to say whatever prosecutors wanted in order to save themselves. Pre-trial motions and hearings delved into the mechanics of the case. Defense lawyers sought access to the full cooperation agreements of key witnesses, hoping to uncover anything that could be used to suggest bias or fabrication. Prosecutors, for their part, fought to protect ongoing investigations and the safety of individuals who had agreed to testify against dangerous former associates. Arguments also erupted over how much of the Colombo family's violent history could be presented to jurors. Prosecutors wanted to show that the doll's murder fit into a consistent pattern of organized violence. The defense argued that piling on uncharged or minimally related episodes would be unfairly prejudicial, painting their client as guilty by association. As the case against Cacace moved slowly toward trial, a related proceeding unfolded in the same courthouse that would have a significant impact on how jurors and the public viewed the doll's allegations. In 2012, reputed Colombo street boss Tommy Shots, Gioli and a younger associate were tried on a sweeping array of racketeering charges that included multiple murders from the family's long history of internal conflict and enforcement. Among the counts were charges linking them to the doll's killing. The government's star witnesses at that trial were some of the same former Colombo members who, in sealed sessions, had placed Cacace in the center of the plot. Over weeks of testimony, jurors heard a grim catalog of underworld business, accounts of sit-downs to resolve disputes, of loan-sharking operations and gambling dens, and of retaliatory violence carried out to uphold the perceived authority of the family. When it came to Ralph Dawes, cooperators described how, they claimed, orders filtered down from leadership to the shooters on the street. They recounted details of the planning and execution that prosecutors argued could only have come from first-hand participants. The picture painted was one of a tightly choreographed hit sanctioned at the highest levels of the Colombo hierarchy. The defense pushed back hard. Attorneys for Gioli and his co-defendant emphasized the benefits the cooperating witnesses stood to gain: dramatically reduced sentences, improved prison conditions, and, in some cases, the possibility of entering witness protection programs. They highlighted inconsistencies between different statements the witnesses had made over the years, suggesting that memories had improved as plea deals solidified. Most of all, they argued that while the witnesses were clearly describing a world of crime and violence, they were inflating or reshaping particular narratives to fit the government's theory in the doll's case. When the jury returned its verdict, the result was mixed. Gioli and his co-defendant were convicted on racketeering conspiracy charges, affirming the government's broader portrayal of them as key figures in a violent criminal enterprise. But they were acquitted of the counts directly tied to Ralph Dawes' murder. The decision stunned many observers. To the Dawes family and to rank-and-file NYPD officers who had followed the trial closely, the acquittals felt like a denial of justice for a fallen colleague. To defense attorneys and some legal analysts, the split verdict suggested that jurors had been careful, willing to hold defendants accountable for provable parts of the conspiracy, but unconvinced that the evidence on the doll's counts met the high standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For prosecutors contemplating how to proceed against Joe Waverly, Cacace, the Gioli verdict was a sobering message. Much of their case against him on the doll's charges rested on the same pool of cooperating witnesses whose testimony had just been partially rejected by a jury. While there were differences in the specific allegations and in the defendants' roles, the underlying challenge was the same. Could they persuade 12 citizens that the recollections of former mobsters, however detailed, were trustworthy enough to support a conviction for ordering the killing of a police officer more than a decade earlier? Behind closed doors, discussions intensified. One option was to press ahead to a full trial, gambling that a different jury, presented with a modified case focusing more tightly on Cacace's alleged role, might reach a different conclusion. Another was to seek a negotiated resolution that would secure an admission of criminal responsibility and a substantial additional sentence without risking a complete acquittal on the doll's counts. For the prosecutors, any outcome had to be weighed against the expectations of the NYPD, the doll's family, and the broader public. For Cacace and his lawyers, the calculation was more personal but just as stark. At his age, and with a federal racketeering sentence already in place, even a relatively modest additional term could ensure that he would die in prison. In 2013, those parallel calculations converged. In a Brooklyn federal courtroom, Joe Waverly, Cacace stood before a judge and entered a guilty plea to a charge of conspiring to commit the murder of Ralph Dawes. The plea was the product of extended negotiations. In exchange for avoiding a full trial on charges that could have exposed him to the most severe penalties available under federal law, he admitted to participating in a plot that led to the killing of an off-duty NYPD officer. According to contemporaneous news reports and court records, the judge imposed an additional 20-year sentence to run consecutive to the term he was already serving for racketeering. Given that Cacace was in his 70s, the sentence amounted to a virtual guarantee that he would never again live outside custody. The allocution, the formal statement in which a defendant acknowledges his conduct, was carefully worded, as such statements often are. Cacace did not deliver a sweeping confession that matched, point for point, the prosecution's theory of the case. He did not stand up and accept every allegation made over the years by cooperating witnesses, but he did concede that he had agreed to the conspiracy that ended with Dawes' death. For the court, and for legal purposes, that admission was enough. For the Dawes family, it was something less than they had hoped for and more than they had feared, a measure of official accountability, but one achieved through compromise rather than a public, contested trial. Reaction to the plea reflected these cross currents. Some NYPD officials welcomed the resolution as a long overdue acknowledgement of guilt at a high level. Others, including officers who had known or worked with Dawes, expressed frustration that the man cooperators identified as the triggerman had been acquitted, and that those who actually pulled the trigger might never face full punishment for that specific crime. Legal commentators noted the irony that cooperating murderers could end up with lighter sentences than the older, higher-ranking man who, according to their stories, had ordered them into action. To prosecutors, that imbalance was the cost of dismantling entrenched criminal organizations. Securing the testimony necessary to reach the top often meant bargaining with those who carried out the dirty work. For Cacace, the plea marked the end of any realistic hope that he might one day walk free. Already incarcerated on a long federal term for his role in the Colombo family's racketeering, he now carried the additional weight of a conviction linked directly to the murder of a police officer. In the closed world of federal prisons, where inmates track one another's cases through rumor and legal paperwork, his status shifted from that of a generic mob guy, serving time on conspiracy charges, to a man whose name was specifically tied to a high-profile, emotionally charged killing. Whatever quiet authority he had once wielded in Brooklyn's social club backrooms was now largely symbolic, its practical power blunted by distance, age, and tighter controls on inmate communications. Outside the prison walls, the world that had shaped him continued to change. The Colombo family, still formally in existence, had been reduced over the years to a shadow of its former self, hobbled by repeated prosecutions, internal betrayals, and the gradual erosion of the old neighborhood structures that had once fed it recruits and provided it cover. Younger generations in the Italian-American communities of Brooklyn and Staten Island were less likely to seek status through the life, and more likely to find it in legitimate professions or in entirely different subcultures. The sort of tight-knit, insular street corners that had first introduced a young Joel Cacace to men of influence were giving way to more fluid, diverse urban spaces. Yet the long arc of his story, from a boy growing up in post-war Brooklyn, to a rising mafia captain, to an imprisoned elder convicted of conspiring to kill a police officer, remained a powerful illustration of how deeply organized crime had once penetrated certain parts of New York's social fabric. The Dolls case, in particular, showed how personal relationships and grievances could become entangled with criminal power structures, leading to outcomes that reverberated far beyond the individuals directly involved. A marriage that might, in another context, have been just one family's complicated story instead became a flashpoint between the underworld and law enforcement, leaving a trail of grief, anger, and eventually, constrained legal closure. For those who studied or battled organized crime, the final judgments against Joe Waverly, Cacace were both an endpoint and a reminder. They closed the chapter on one man's long career in the shadows, but left open broader questions about how such careers had been allowed to flourish in the first place. About the economic conditions that made mob money attractive, the cultural codes that glamorized or excused its power, and the institutional blind spots that, for decades, had permitted men like Cacace to operate with relative impunity. The remaining years of his life, spent moving through the routines of the federal prison system, would unfold far from the streets and social clubs that had once defined him, even as the legal and moral debates his actions inspired continued in courtrooms, police academies, and the memories of those whose lives had intersected with his. By the time Joe Waverly, Cacace shuffled back into the federal system with an extra 20-year sentence added to his name in 2013, the world he had once helped direct from a Brooklyn social club existed mostly in memory and court transcripts. He was in his early 70s, no longer the low-profile but powerful street figure who drew quiet deference in Bensonhurst or Gravesend, but an aging inmate in a network of institutions designed to keep men like him contained until they died. Federal prison life for an older organized crime figure is, in many respects, unremarkable. The routines are the same as for anyone else: counts, meals, work assignments, medical appointments, and the long stretches in between. Yet there are subtle differences. Guards and fellow inmates are rarely ignorant of who someone like Cacace is. Court documents, news clippings, and the inevitable prison gossip ensure that reputations follow people inside. Among prisoners, the fact that he had been a consigliere and acting boss in one of New York's 5 families, and that he now carried a conviction tied to the conspiracy to kill a police officer, made him a man to be noted, even if his actual day-to-day influence was limited by age and security protocols. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons does not publicly detail each inmate's housing history, but available records show that Cacace was assigned to high-security facilities appropriate for someone with violent convictions and organized crime ties. In such settings, contact with the outside world is monitored and constrained. Letters are screened, phone calls are recorded and limited in duration, visits are observed. For a man who had once conducted sensitive business in person precisely to avoid the ears of law enforcement, the irony was sharp. Every word he spoke to his remaining friends and family on the outside now passed through the same kind of institutional scrutiny he had spent his life trying to evade. Growing old in prison is a stark process. For inmates in their 20s or 30s, time behind bars can be imagined as a chapter to be survived and left behind. For someone in his 70s with decades of combined sentences, the horizon is different. Medical issues accumulate. The focus shifts from appeals and legal strategies to questions of healthcare, mobility, and basic comfort. Federal facilities have specialized units for aging and infirm prisoners, and while it is not publicly known exactly how or where Cacace has been treated over the years, it is clear that he has now spent a significant portion of his later life navigating institutional clinics and procedures rather than the doctors and hospitals available to most citizens. Outside those walls, the legal story of the Colombo crime family continued to evolve. The plea that added 20 years to Cacace's sentence did not mean that federal authorities were finished with his former associates. In 2011, even before his formal admission in the Dolls case, a major racketeering indictment in Brooklyn targeted what remained of the family's active leadership, charging them with a familiar array of crimes: extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and violence. Among those swept up in such cases over the years was his own son, Joel Jr., who appeared in court as a Colombo associate implicated in extortion and related schemes. For observers, the sight of another Cacace on a federal docket underscored how organized crime involvement could thread through generations, even as the overall power and glamour of the old mafia structures declined. Law enforcement priorities were also shifting in this period. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, counterterrorism became the driving focus of federal investigative resources in New York and nationwide. The classic mafia squads that had spent the 1970s, 80s, and 90s wiring social clubs and flipping insiders saw their numbers reduced or redeployed. Yet the tools developed to fight organized crime, particularly the use of racketeering statutes and long-term informants, continued to shape how the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices approached complex criminal networks of all kinds, from gangs to corrupt corporations. The lessons learned in cases like those against the Colombo family did not vanish. They migrated into new arenas. In the narrower world of Cosa Nostra, the consequences of decades of prosecutions were unmistakable. By the mid-2010s, all of New York's 5 families had seen generation after generation of leaders indicted, convicted, and imprisoned. The image of the untouchable, long-reigning boss, living openly in his home neighborhood and holding court in a favorite restaurant was, by then, largely a relic. The Colombo family, which had already been the smallest of the 5 in traditional assessments, was particularly weakened. Internal wars, high-profile turncoats, and the cumulative effect of repeated racketeering trials had thinned its ranks and eroded its influence in unions and businesses. Cacace's own trajectory reflected this arc. In the 1980s and early 1990s, law enforcement charts placed him high among the names of active leaders: a captain, a consigliere, sometimes an acting boss. By the time he accepted the Dolls conspiracy plea in 2013, he had become, in organizational terms, part of the historical leadership, a man whose decisions in previous decades formed the background of newer cases, even as his ability to shape current events had been curtailed by incarceration. His name appeared in indictment narratives as a marker of continuity, a reminder that the crimes being charged were the products of a culture and structure that had developed over many years. Inside prison, former mob bosses and captains from different families sometimes ended up housed in the same institutions, creating small, odd communities of men who had once watched one another warily across New York's borough lines. Each carried his own history of alliances and rivalries, but the rigid hierarchies of the street were partly flattened by the realities of shared confinement. While specific details of Cacace's interactions behind bars are not public, the general pattern for aging organized crime figures is clear. Conversations in prison yards or common rooms tend to revolve less around ongoing business and more around health complaints, legal news from the outside, and recollections of a world that no longer quite exists. Occasionally, journalists or authors attempted to draw these veterans of the underworld into reflective interviews, hoping to extract insights or admissions about their former lives. In some cases, mobsters nearing the end of long sentences chose to speak, publishing memoirs or participating in documentary projects. In others, they maintained a lifelong adherence to the old code of silence, refusing to cooperate with either law enforcement or the media. Joe Waverly, Cacace, falls into the latter category. There are no recorded interviews in which he explains his choices, expresses remorse, or offers his own version of disputed events. The closest thing to a personal statement on record is the sparse allocution at his guilty pleas, in which legal necessity, not self-revelation, dictated his words. This silence has consequences for how his life story can be told. Without memoirs or cooperative interviews, historians and journalists are left to reconstruct his trajectory from law enforcement files, court transcripts, press coverage, and the accounts of former associates who chose to cooperate. Those sources are rich in detail about crimes, structures, and conflicts, but poor in the sort of interior perspective that might explain how he saw himself. Was he, in his own mind, a pragmatic businessman operating in a parallel economy, a loyal subordinate in a system he believed in, a man trapped by early choices? The record offers no clear answer, and the documentary voice that tells his story must resist the temptation to imagine one. The legal legacy of his cases, however, is more concrete. The combination of his racketeering conviction and the later Dahl's conspiracy plea illustrates several key features of modern organized crime prosecution. First, the centrality of RICO, which allows prosecutors to present jurors with a narrative of criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents. Under that framework, someone like Cacace could be held responsible not only for acts he personally carried out, but also for crimes committed by subordinates as part of a shared conspiracy. Second, the reliance on insider witnesses, men who once swore to uphold the mafia's code of silence, but who later decided that cooperation with the government offered them better odds than loyalty to former bosses. These aspects of the legal strategy sparked ongoing debates, both within the criminal justice community and in broader public discourse. Supporters argued that without such tools, men like Cacace, who operated behind layers of intermediaries and rarely left direct fingerprints on violent acts, would remain effectively immune from meaningful prosecution. Critics worried that the heavy dependence on cooperator testimony created incentives for exaggeration or fabrication, particularly in high-profile cases like the Dahl's murder. The split verdicts in related trials, the years-long delay in bringing charges, and the eventual plea deal all underscored how difficult it could be to translate strong suspicions and insider narratives into airtight courtroom victories. For the communities where Cacace once moved freely, the long saga of investigations and trials left mixed feelings. On one hand, the dismantling of old-style mob control in certain industries, such as construction, trucking, and some unions, created space for more transparent, legally regulated operations. On the other, the economic frustrations and social gaps that had once made mob influence attractive did not simply vanish. In some neighborhoods, new forms of criminal organization took root. In others, underemployment and disillusionment persisted, even as the particular figures who had dominated local headlines in the 1970s and 80s aged into irrelevance or died behind bars. The families directly affected by Cacace's alleged and admitted actions also carried forward complex legacies. Relatives of those killed in the Colombo War of the early 1990s and of Ralph Dahl's in 1997 had to navigate both private grief and public narratives that often simplified their loved ones' lives into symbols of larger themes. Mob violence, a fallen cop, collateral damage. For them, each new development, a conviction, an acquittal, a plea, could reopen old wounds even as it promised closure. The knowledge that some participants in specific crimes might never be formally identified or punished added another layer of frustration. As the years after his Dahl's plea passed, one fact became increasingly clear. Joe Waverly, Cacace would not again be a free man. Bureau of Prisons records reflect projected release dates that extend well beyond the likely span of his natural life. For a man whose early adulthood was spent largely outside institutional walls, building influence in the informal power structures of Brooklyn's Italian-American neighborhoods, the contrast could not be sharper. His remaining world, cell, corridor, yard, visiting room, was now defined by rules set by the same kind of authority he had once routinely sought to circumvent or corrupt. Meanwhile, the cultural memory of the mafia era that had formed him was being reshaped. Films and television series continued to mine organized crime for drama, often set in the mid-20th century heyday of Cosa Nostra, or in the turbulent years of internal wars and federal crackdowns. Academic studies and non-fiction books examine the phenomenon from sociological, economic, and legal perspectives, probing why communities tolerated or even quietly supported such organizations for so long. In many of these accounts, names like Gambino, Genovese, and Gotti loomed large. The Colombo family, smaller and more internally divided, received less popular attention. Within that more obscure corner of history, figures such as Cacace existed mainly as citations in footnotes or as brief sketches in chapters focused on specific cases like the doll's murder. Yet for specialists, prosecutors, defense attorneys, investigators, and scholars, his career remained illustrative. It showed how someone from a modest background could, by combining discretion, loyalty to a particular faction, and a willingness to participate in coercive schemes, rise high within an organized crime hierarchy. It demonstrated the limits of early law enforcement approaches that focused narrowly on individual crimes rather than on the enterprises behind them. And it underscored how, even after decades of improvement in investigative techniques, some major cases would still hinge on human factors: who chose to talk, who remained silent, and how juries responded to the fraught testimony of former insiders. In the end, the historical record presents Joe Waverly, Cacace less as a flamboyant, self-mythologizing gangster, and more as a steady, organizational man of the old mafia. Someone who avoided the cameras, preferred the back room to the front table, and worked for years to keep his name out of the newspapers. Ironically, it was precisely that preference for the shadows that made his eventual fall more dramatic. When he finally did enter the public eye, through indictments tying him to a vicious internal war, to the upper ranks of the Colombo family, and ultimately to the conspiracy behind the killing of a New York City police officer, he did so not on his own terms, but in the stark, constrained language of federal charging documents and plea hearings. As the story of his life moves deeper into its final stages within the prison system, what remains for outside observers is less the man himself than what his rise and fall reveal about a particular era in American urban history. His biography intersects with the peak and decline of traditional Italian-American organized crime, the maturation of federal tools to combat such groups, and the persistent, human costs of violence used to enforce an illicit order. Whatever personal reflections he may entertain in his remaining years are, for now, known only to him. The record he leaves behind is written instead in the neighborhoods he once helped shape, the courtrooms where his name was spoken, and the families, criminal and non-criminal alike, whose lives were altered by the choices he made. In the years after Joe Waverly, Cacace stood in a Brooklyn courtroom and acknowledged his role in the conspiracy that ended with the death of Ralph Dawes. The legal machinery around his name slowed, but did not completely stop. Formal trials were over. The dramatic spectacles of mob figures shuttled in and out of court under heavy guard had given way to the quieter, more technical world of post-conviction motions and appeals. For a man in his 70s with multiple long federal sentences, the stakes were less about eventual freedom than about the record itself, what it would say, and what it would leave contested about his responsibility and his past. As is routine in complex federal cases, his convictions and sentences drew appellate scrutiny. Publicly available records reflect that lawyers examined familiar lines of argument, whether plea agreements had been properly handled, whether sentencing guidelines were correctly applied, and whether the use of certain cooperator testimony or evidentiary rulings had crossed legal boundaries. None of these efforts altered the basic outcome. The racketeering conviction that had first put him behind bars remained intact, and the additional 20-year term for the Dolls conspiracy stood as imposed. Whatever debate continued about the fine points of his legal journey, the practical reality was settled. Joel Cacace would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. Outside the prison walls, his cases continued to echo, especially within circles concerned with policing and organized crime. The murder of Ralph Dolls, and the long path to securing a conviction tied to it, became a reference point in discussions about the risks officers face even when off duty, and about the lengths to which high-ranking criminals might go when they perceive a personal affront. Training sessions for detectives and prosecutors occasionally used the case as a study in investigative persistence, the need to keep unsolved homicides active, to preserve evidence, and to revisit old leads when new cooperators surface years later. The fact that it took more than a decade and a half to obtain a formal admission of guilt from one of the figures at the top of the alleged conspiracy underscored both the difficulty of such work and the determination of those who refused to let the file be closed as unknown. Within organized crime scholarship, the trajectory of Cacace's life and the Dolls' prosecution fed into a broader reassessment of how the American mafia used violence in its later decades. Earlier generations of bosses had been careful, at least in theory, to avoid drawing the concentrated wrath of law enforcement by killing public officials. When such crimes did occur, they tended to become turning points. The assassination of a judge, a police officer, or a politician often spurred legislative reforms and intensified crackdowns. In that sense, the allegation that senior Colombo figures had authorized the killing of an NYPD officer because of a personal relationship struck many observers as both a continuity and a departure. It fit the traditional pattern of using violence to enforce the organization's codes and protect its leadership. Yet it also suggested a breakdown in the kind of restrained calculation that earlier bosses had claimed to prize. In the Dolls case, the Justice Department confronted another thorny question: whether to pursue the death penalty. Under federal law, the murder of a law enforcement officer can qualify as a capital crime, and in the years after the offense, press reports indicated that prosecutors weighed that option. The decision whether to seek capital punishment rests not only on the facts of a particular case, but also on broader policy judgments within the Department of Justice. Ultimately, the government chose not to ask for death in Cacace's case, a choice that reflected, among other things, his age, the complexity of the evidence, and shifting national attitudes toward capital punishment. Instead, they focused on securing a substantial term of years that, combined with his existing sentence, would amount to life. This outcome illustrated a tension that had become increasingly familiar in organized crime prosecutions. Authorities wanted, understandably, to send a strong message that killing or conspiring to kill an officer would be met with the gravest possible consequences. At the same time, they had to reckon with the realities of what they could prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, particularly when relying on witnesses with extensive criminal histories. A plea carrying a long additional sentence, while less theatrical than a death penalty trial, offered certainty where a jury might not. That calculus, in turn, shaped how defendants like Cacace assessed their own options, often leading them to accept deals that avoided the risk of a maximal sentence in exchange for admissions they might otherwise never have made. For Italian-American communities in Brooklyn and beyond, figures like Cacace posed a stubborn representational problem. On one level, his story reaffirmed stereotypes that many community leaders had spent decades working to dispel. The notion that Italians in New York were somehow inherently linked to organized crime. Advocacy groups and civic organizations had, since the 1970s, pushed back against sensationalized media portrayals, arguing, accurately, that the vast majority of Italian Americans were law-abiding, and that cultural pride need not be tainted by the actions of a small criminal minority. Yet when a case as dramatic as the killing of a police officer broke through into the headlines, with names like Joe Waverly and Colombo family consigliere attached, it was these older tropes that many casual observers reached for again. The discomfort was not new. In earlier decades, activists had criticized both news outlets and law enforcement agencies for using terms like mafia or la Cosa Nostra, as though they were synonymous with Italian ethnicity. The high-profile self-promoting behavior of some mob figures, who embraced the imagery and language of ethnic brotherhood for their own ends, made this work harder. Cacace, by contrast, had rarely sought public attention. He did not give interviews or cultivate a flamboyant image. If anything, he represented the quieter, more insidious way organized crime could operate. Embedded in ordinary-seeming neighborhoods, drawing on kinship and language to build trust and enforce secrecy, while presenting to the outside world the appearance of just another local man going about his business. For his immediate family, the consequences of his choices and convictions were painfully direct. Children and other relatives had to live with a dual stigma: the knowledge, backed by court records, that their father or uncle had been a high-ranking participant in a criminal organization, and the overlay of sensational coverage linking him to the death of a police officer. Some undoubtedly rejected the underworld path entirely, choosing professions and social circles far removed from the world that had ensnared him. Others may have struggled to reconcile a private experience of him, as a father, grandfather, or older relative, with the hardened image presented in indictments and news articles. The details of those relationships remain private, but the broad pattern is familiar in studies of organized crime families. Affection and loyalty coexisting uneasily with disappointment or anger over the harm inflicted on others. The generational dimension of his story extended beyond his own bloodline. Young men in the neighborhoods where he had once wielded influence grew up hearing different kinds of stories about the life. In the 1960s and 1970s, tales of local mob figures often emphasized their perceived power, their ability to take care of things, and the immediate cash they commanded. By the 1990s and 2000s, another narrative had taken hold alongside this one, that of aging bosses and soldiers being led into court, sentenced to decades in prison, and vanishing into the federal system. The spectacle of once formidable men like Cacace, Persico, and others now frail and shackled in courtroom wheelchairs served as a visual counter-argument to whatever residual glamour attached to organized crime. Even if some youth still found aspects of that world alluring, the dangers were harder to ignore. In this way, the long arc of Cacace's life became, unintentionally, part of an informal deterrent campaign. Law enforcement agencies and community groups could point to him not only as an example of the damage the mafia had done, but also as a cautionary tale about where such involvement ultimately led. Presentations to high school students or neighborhood associations sometimes included simplified sketches of men like him, how they started, how high they rose, and how they ended up. These narratives did not always capture the full complexity of individual lives, but they were effective in conveying a basic message. Whatever temporary benefits or status organized crime seemed to offer, the likely destination was prison, death, or both. At the same time, criminologists and historians cautioned against viewing his downfall as proof that the underlying conditions that had fostered organized crime had been fully resolved. Economic inequality, limited access to legitimate opportunity, and distrust of institutions remained features of many urban neighborhoods. While traditional Italian-American mafia families had declined, other criminal groups, drawn from different ethnic and national backgrounds, and often more loosely structured, stepped into some of the same spaces. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, cybercrime, and sophisticated financial fraud posed challenges that in some ways exceeded those of the old Cosa Nostra, precisely because they were less tied to specific communities and more global in scope. From this perspective, the narrative of Joe Waverly, Cacace's life was both specific and symbolic. It was specific in its details. The Colombo family's internal wars, the personal dynamics around his former marriage, the painstaking investigation into the doll's murder. Yet it was symbolic of a broader cycle, the emergence of a criminal subculture within a marginalized community, its entanglement with local economies and social networks, the eventual mobilization of state power to suppress it, and the lingering effects on everyone involved. His story could not be reduced to a simple morality play. He was neither an inexplicable monster nor a folk hero, but it did offer lessons about how individual ambition and systemic failure interact. Within the legal community, debates about the proper balance between punishing leaders like Cacace and offering deals to their underlings continued. Some critics of the doll's resolution argued that it was unjust for certain triggermen or lower-level conspirators to receive comparatively lighter sentences in exchange for their testimony against an older man who might have spent the rest of his life behind bars, even without the additional term. Others countered that without such cooperation, it would be almost impossible to hold high-level decision-makers accountable, given their distance from the physical commission of many crimes. The Cacace case, with its combination of earlier acquittals, partial convictions, and eventual plea, became one of the examples lawyers cited when discussing these dilemmas. The question of remorse, whether he felt it, whether it mattered, hovered over many of these conversations. Because he never gave extended interviews or wrote a memoir, and because his courtroom statements were carefully constrained by legal advice, there is no direct record of his inner reflections. Some observers assume that a man who maintained silence for so long, even when cooperation might have eased his own conditions, had accepted a certain view of loyalty and consequence and saw little point in public contrition. Others speculated that age and isolation might eventually have brought private regrets, even if he never expressed them beyond a trusted circle or a prison chapel. Lacking evidence, such conjectures remain just that, and serious historical accounts have to acknowledge the gap rather than fill it with imagined speeches or convenient emotions. What can be documented is how institutions responded. The NYPD memorialized Ralph Dahls alongside other officers killed in the line of duty, regardless of whether they had been on or off duty at the time. His name joined a larger roll call that officers hear during ceremonies and remembrances, a reminder of the risks inherent in the profession. For the department, the belated federal conviction of a former organized crime leader for conspiring in his death reinforced a narrative of resilience, that even when justice is delayed, it is not necessarily denied. For the Dahls family, that institutional recognition could not restore what was lost, but it did ensure that his story was not subsumed entirely into that of the men who plotted against him. Meanwhile, the Colombo family's presence on the street continued to recede. Informants and undercover operations revealed smaller, more fragmented crews engaging in scaled-down versions of old rackets. The elaborate, multi-layered structure that had once placed men like Cacace near the top was fraying. Younger members often combined criminal activity with nominally legitimate jobs, the clear lines between made man, associate, and ordinary neighbor blurred. In this diluted environment, the kind of authority he had exercised decades earlier, over crews, over disputes, over revenue, was difficult for anyone to reconstitute, even if they desired to. By the early 2020s, references to Joe Waverly, Cacace in contemporary reporting were increasingly retrospective, appearing mainly in anniversary pieces about the Dahls case or in broader looks back at New York's mafia past. For most New Yorkers, his name meant little unless they had followed organized crime stories closely or lived through the period when such figures loomed large in local consciousness. Time had moved on. New concerns occupied headlines and public debate. Yet for those who study the history of crime and justice in the city, his life remained a useful lens, precisely because it cut across so many themes: ethnic identity, neighborhood change, law enforcement evolution, and the ways in which personal choices intersect with structural forces. As he aged inside the federal system, reports occasionally surfaced about the declining health of older mob inmates generally: heart disease, diabetes, the familiar burdens of advancing years. These notices rarely named individuals, but the demographic they described plainly included men like Cacace. Prison chaplains and medical staff saw them cycle through infirmaries and hospice like units, far from the blocks and storefronts where they had once held sway. The end of such lives was often quiet, recorded in simple entries in institutional logs and in the Bureau of Prisons' inmate locator, with little public notice unless a reporter or true crime enthusiast happened to check. Whether his final years bring any unexpected developments, legal, medical, or personal, remains beyond the scope of the public record available today. What is clear is that, by the time he reached his 80s, the arc of his life had largely been drawn. The boy who grew up in post-war Brooklyn, the rising Colombo captain, the behind-the-scenes consigliere, the indicted elder facing allegations in a police officer's murder, and the long-term federal inmate. All these phases now exist primarily in the stories others tell about him. Those stories, filtered through court documents, news accounts, and the recollections of former colleagues and adversaries, form the basis for understanding not just one man's choices, but an entire chapter in the history of American organized crime. Looking back across the many decades that Joe Waverly, Cacace's life has spanned, one of the most striking things is how little of his own voice appears in the historical record. The man who moved in back rooms and side streets, who sat in on strategy sessions for the Colombo crime family and later sat stone-faced in federal courtrooms, left behind almost no direct testimony about what he thought he was doing and why. Instead, what survives are the voices of others: investigators writing reports, prosecutors arguing cases, defense lawyers pushing back, journalists trying to make sense of it all, and former associates who decided to trade silence for reduced sentences. The story of his rise and fall emerges from the friction between these sources, each shaped by its own pressures, each carrying its own biases. Federal investigative files, where his name first appears in the late 1960s and 1970s, are clipped and impersonal. An agent notes that Joe Cacace, aka Waverly, was observed entering a known Colombo hangout at approximately 2100 hours. Another records that confidential sources identified him as an associate of a particular captain. Early on, the entries are tentative, hedged by the cautious language of intelligence rather than the certainty of evidence. Believed to be, reported as, possibly involved in. Only later, as more informants come forward and surveillance technology improves, do the documents speak with firmer confidence about his status within the family. Even then, they remain external assessments, describing his movements and apparent rank rather than his inner life. Courtrooms add more texture. Indictments and trial transcripts preserve long stretches of narrative: who met where, what was allegedly said, how money and orders supposedly flowed. Cooperating witnesses under oath paint vivid pictures of meetings where Cacace sat at the head of a table or in a favored corner of a social club, listening more than talking, intervening when disputes needed to be resolved or when a decision reached the level where a capo or consigliere had to weigh in. They recount conversations in which, they say, his approval was sought before violent action was taken, including in the chain of events that led to the killing of Ralph Dawes. Defense attorneys counter with relentless cross-examinations, reminding jurors of the witnesses' own crimes, their hopes for leniency, and the gaps or shifts in their accounts over time. Sentencing memos and plea hearings offer still another angle. Their prosecutors summarize a career in a few dense pages: participation in a criminal enterprise spanning decades, leadership roles, specific episodes of extortion, racketeering, and conspiracy. Defense submissions emphasize age, health, family ties, and any mitigating factors they can credibly raise. Judges, in turn, situate individual crime within broader patterns. In written opinions and remarks from the bench, several jurists who presided over cases involving the Colombo family noted the corrosive effect that long-term mob influence had on businesses, unions, and neighborhoods, even when the violence was not as spectacular as a high-profile murder. What is almost entirely absent from these formal records is anything like confession or self-explanation. Unlike some former mobsters who eventually published memoirs or cooperated with documentary makers after leaving prison, Cacace kept his own counsel. He did not, as far as can be determined from public sources, sit for extended debriefings in which he might have sketched his path from Brooklyn youth to senior mafia figure, or reflected on the harm done and the price paid. The admissions he made in court were tightly circumscribed by legal necessity, enough to satisfy the elements of the charges to which he was pleading, but nothing more. For historians, this silence is a hard limit. One can trace his actions, outline his influence, and locate him within larger structures, but one cannot legitimately ascribe motives or regrets beyond what can be inferred from patterns of behavior. Placed against the longer history of organized crime in America, his life occupies a particular middle space. The first generation of mafia bosses in New York, the men who fought through the bloody transformations of the Prohibition era and the early 1930s, were already entrenched figures by the time he was born in 1941. They created the system of families that would dominate Italian-American organized crime for much of the 20th century, with clear hierarchies, initiation rituals, and codes of conduct. By the time Cacace came of age in post-war Brooklyn, that system was established enough that a young man with the right connections and the right temperament could enter it not as a pioneer, but as a career choice, however informal and illicit. He rose during the second great phase of that system's history, the period from the 1960s through the 1980s when New York's five families used their clout to infiltrate unions, manipulate construction and trucking, skim from casinos, and run large-scale gambling and loan sharking operations, while simultaneously facing increasing attention from Congress, the FBI, and local prosecutors. The Colombo family, though smaller than some of its counterparts, was deeply involved in this world. It had influence in certain labor unions and industries, and it carved out slices of New York's illegal gambling and loan markets. Within that framework, Cacace built a reputation as the kind of manager any boss valued: calm, low-key, effective, and loyal to a dominant faction. But he also lived through the third phase, the era of sustained federal counter-offensive. The Appalachian Meeting and Joseph Valach's Senate testimony in the late 1950s and early 1960s had exposed the existence of a national crime network. But it was the passage and aggressive use of the Racketeer-influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in the 1970s and 1980s that truly shifted the balance. RICO allowed prosecutors to present organized crime as organized crime, to show juries how individual acts of violence, extortion, and fraud fit into an overarching enterprise with rules, profits, and leadership. It was under this statute that Carmine Persico, Victor Orna, and eventually Cacace himself would be indicted and convicted. In this sense, his career tracks the arc of a system that grew rapidly, entrenched itself in certain sectors of urban life, and then was gradually but decisively constrained by state power. At each stage, the same basic dynamic played out. Conditions of poverty and limited opportunity in certain neighborhoods made the offer of easy money and protection attractive. Cultural and kinship ties provided a ready-made basis for trust and recruitment, and weak or corrupt oversight in unions and businesses created opportunities to extract illicit profits. Then, slowly, investigative techniques improved, laws changed, and public tolerance diminished. Men who had once acted with relative impunity found themselves in handcuffs more and more often, and their organizations struggled to adapt. The Colombo family's own internal history intensified these pressures. It was marked, more than most, by recurrent civil wars. In the early 1960s, the Gallo Rebellion against boss Joseph Cacace plunged the organization into bloody strife. 3 decades later, the Persico-Orna War of the early 1990s, the conflict that unfolded while Cacace was a captain and then a key Persico loyalist, brought open gunfights to New York streets and gave prosecutors vivid examples of intra-family violence to present to juries. Internal instability made it harder for the Colombos to maintain cohesive control over their rackets and made it easier for law enforcement to recruit disillusioned insiders. It also placed leaders like Cacace in situations where choices about loyalty and retaliation had unusually high stakes. If the institutional history explains part of the story, the social context explains another. The Italian-American neighborhoods that formed the backdrop of his youth were, by all accounts, places of both solidarity and constraint. In the years after World War II, many families moved outward, to the suburbs, to white-collar jobs, to universities, carrying with them a pride in their heritage but loosening the tight street corner networks that had characterized earlier immigrant enclaves. Those who remained in the old neighborhoods, whether by choice or limited means, often inhabited a world where the local social club on the avenue had more visible authority than distant city hall, and where the line between respectable and connected was thin. Figures like Cacace thrived in that liminal space. They presented themselves as problem solvers, able to smooth disputes, provide loans, and get things done when official channels seemed slow or unresponsive. Many residents understood, at least in outline, that this help came with strings attached, that the money offered at the back table of a cafe would be repaid at terms far harsher than any bank, that the quiet threat behind a protection offer was real. Yet for small business owners squeezed by changing economic conditions, and for workers who distrusted the police or courts, the trade-off sometimes seemed worthwhile in the short term. Over time, those compromises enabled the entrenchment of criminal power. The damage was not confined to those who directly borrowed from or defied mob crews. Union members saw pension funds siphoned off and contracts manipulated. Competing businesses were pressured out of certain markets. Public construction and service projects, influenced by corrupt deals, became more expensive for taxpayers. Violence, even when not constant, served as a grim backdrop, a reminder that underlying all the talk of respect and tradition was the willingness to use lethal force. The killing of Ralph Dawes, with its blend of personal grievance and organizational sanction, epitomized this reality. It showed how a private relationship could be recast as a threat to mob authority and answered not with argument but with bullets. Law enforcement responses, in turn, evolved through trial and error. Early efforts to combat organized crime often focused on visible, low-level offenses: illegal gambling parlors, numbers runners, street extortion. Arrests cycled through the courts with modest sentences and little lasting impact on the higher echelons. Over time, investigators learned to treat killings and rackets not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a larger organism. Wiretaps, undercover agents, and flipped insiders became standard tools. The prosecution of Cacace and his peers across multiple decades shows both the strengths and limits of this approach. It could document patterns and dismantle hierarchies, but it frequently relied on morally compromised witnesses whose testimony jurors viewed with understandable skepticism. The Dawes case crystallized many of these tensions. Here was a victim who embodied public service, killed in a manner that suggested organized planning. Here was a suspect, Cacace, whose criminal stature was established, but whose direct involvement in this particular crime rested largely on the accounts of men who admitted their own participation and sought leniency. The long delay between the murder and the eventual plea, the mixed verdicts in related trials, and the negotiated nature of his final admission all illustrated how complex and imperfect the pursuit of justice can be in such circumstances. For some, the additional 20-year sentence he received felt like an appropriate measure of accountability. For others, nothing short of full convictions for every alleged shooter and planner could have sufficed. Ultimately, the meaning of Cacace's life and crimes does not lie only in the punishment he received, but in what his story reveals about the interplay between individual agency and structural forces. He did not choose the time or place of his birth, nor the fact that organized crime was a visible and powerful presence in his neighborhood as he grew up. But he did, at various points, choose to align himself with that presence, to accept initiation, to run rackets that depended on intimidation, and according to his own later admission, to participate in a conspiracy that ended with a police officer's death. Those choices accrued over time into a role that brought him wealth, status within a particular subculture, and eventually the near total loss of his liberty. State, for its part, responded slowly at first and then with increasing sophistication and severity. Changes in law and policy were driven by public outrage over earlier crimes, by political calculations, and by the professional determination of investigators and prosecutors who refused to accept criminal control over unions, neighborhoods, and industries as a fixed fact. Their work constrained, though did not entirely eliminate, the power of organizations like the Colombo family. The long list of imprisoned and deceased mob leaders, including Cacace, stands as testimony to what sustained enforcement can achieve, even as new forms of criminal enterprise arise to exploit fresh opportunities. In the end, the legacy of Joe Waverly, Cacace, is not one that lends itself to easy summary. He was not the flamboyant, camera-seeking boss who dominates popular culture, nor the repentant former insider who later narrates his own transformation. He was instead a durable functionary of a particular order, a man who spent decades helping to maintain a system of clandestine authority and profit, and who then spent the closing decades of his life in an institution designed to negate that authority and strip away that profit. His name, once spoken in low tones in Brooklyn clubs and on scratchy FBI tapes, now resides mostly in archives, legal databases, and the memories of those who intersected with his story. For the families who lost loved ones to Colombo-related violence, including the family of Ralph Dawes, those records are a thin substitute for what was taken. For the neighborhoods where he operated, the decline of the system he served opened space for different futures, though not always the kind of stability and prosperity residents might have hoped for. For scholars, his biography provides a thread through which to examine a half-century of change in American cities, law enforcement, and organized crime. And for anyone seeking to understand how a young man from an ordinary Brooklyn background could become a central figure in a notorious criminal organization, his life stands as a reminder that such transformations do not happen in isolation. They grow, incrementally, from the friction between personal ambition, community norms, and the strengths and weaknesses of the institutions meant to uphold the law.